Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Chargers Analytics with Arjun. In this episode, we are going to be taking a look at a topic brought up in the comments, specifically by Kevin Kernick. Kevin, shout out to you for this idea, man. In this episode, we're going to be looking at an Alvin Kamara versus Austin Ekeler comparison and try to see how Austin Ekeler is really going to be used in this offense ran by Joe Lombardi. Now, it's going to be really interesting because 2019 and 2020, Drew Brees was injured and they had other quarterbacks playing like Teddy Bridgewater and Taysom Hill. So trying to really predict how Austin Ekeler is going to be used is going to be a little bit of a challenge. But luckily, we have some data that we can try to mitigate that, unpredictability based on how Drew Brees was playing and how the Saints offense was for the past 2 years. So as usual, let's dive straight into the data. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is snaps by position, right? So if you can see the blue bars represent how many times on average on a rate basis that the running back lined up in the backfield. The yellow bar is how many times they lined up in the slot as a percentage. And then the green bar is lining up out wide. So it'd be like, lining up against a linebacker on the outside. So let's just go through the numbers. So in 2020, right, Austin Ekeler lined up in the backfield at about an 85% clip, right? So he wasn't really used that much as a receiver in the slot and out wide. You can see only 8.75% in the slot and 6.55% out wide. So Anthony Lynn and Shane Steichen didn't really use him that much as a receiver. But honestly, this is not like that hard to visualize just because Austin Ekeler was coming off such a major injury. But if we go to 2019, this number drops by about 10%, right? He lines up in the backfield only 74.5% of the time, lined up in the slot 12% of the time, and lined up out wide 13.5% of the time. So we can see almost like a 4% increase from the slot or 4% decrease from 2019 to 2020, and about a 7% decrease from 2019 to 2020. Now, this is explainable just because Melvin Gordon was playing for the Chargers in 2019. So, you want to get one of your best offensive weapons in Austin Ekeler on the field. So instead of having a guy like Andre Patton in the slot, you could put Austin Ekeler in there, or you line him up out wide. And if you guys remember that Chargers-Titans game in 2019 where, Melvin Gordon did fumble at the one, Austin Ekeler had that like 40-yard touchdown where he was lined up out wide on a linebacker. And it just shows you how versatile of a weapon he is. So obviously wasn't happy to see this trend where his snaps decreased as a receiver, but it was expected just because he wasn't 100% based on his hamstring injury. So his route running probably wasn't the most precise. Now, if we look at Alvin Kamara in 2020, lined up in the backfield 78% of the time, lined up in the slot right about 11% of the time, and lined up out wide 11% of the time. So kind of similar numbers to Austin Ekeler in 2019. And, Alvin Kamara does play alongside Latavius Murray. I don't think Latavius Murray is on Melvin Gordon's level, but it's, Alvin Kamara is one of the top pass catching backs in the league. So to see him line up outside of the backfield at this high of a clip isn't that surprising to me. Now in 2019, Alvin Kamara was hurt. Don't forget he had a little bit of a knee injury. So lined up in the backfield 80% of the time in 2019, lined up in the slot 9.6% of the time, and lined up out wide 10.24% of the time. Okay, now Kevin also wanted to look at, some of the running backs from the Lions in 2014. So the Lions really had 3 running backs during this era. It was number 1, Joique Bell. Please excuse me if I said his name wrong. I'm not that big of a Lions fan, but Joique Bell was the bell cow back, you could say. Reggie Bush was, kind of the do-it-all back. And then Theo Riddick was the pass catching back. So I decided to take a look at Riddick and Bush, both whose play styles kind of emulate Kamara and Ekeler because they can both catch the ball. So I'll start with Reggie Bush, lined up in the backfield 82.4% of the time, lined up in the slot 12.6% of the time, and lined up out wide right about 5% of the time. Now Theo Riddick lined up in the backfield right about 79% of the time. He lined up out in the slot, 20% of the time. And then he lined up out wide. He didn't really line up out wide that much, right? So we can see that with the Lions, they try to move their running backs around a little bit. I will admit Riddick and Bush's snap counts, like on a total level, not looking at just rate, but like on a total snap count level, they weren't as high as Joik Bell's. That's why I wanted to use percentages, because it eliminates the idea of volume. So you can really just focus in on the rate at which a player lined up at a certain position. Now, let's just look at Alvin Kamara and Austin Ekeler's advanced stats from the past 2 years. So not advanced stats, but just, stats in general. So we're going to start with targets. Alvin Kamara, 2020, 103 targets. In 2019, 95 targets. I believe he missed like 2 games here also. So this number could probably be higher, but, just still a pretty high number for a running back, I will admit. In 2020, Austin Ekeler had 60 targets. And in 2019, Ekeler had 104 targets, despite being, the quote unquote 1B to Melvin Gordon. So I would estimate Austin Ekeler is going to get targeted a lot. Like I could see 90 plus targets for Austin Ekeler just based on how Alvin Kamara was used in that Saints offense. A lot of screens and a lot of option routes. And I think option routes are the one place where Ekeler and Kamara could really, cause havoc for defenses, just because you can't stick a linebacker on them. They could, maneuver them in space and beat them with their route running. All right, so the second side we're going to look at is catches. In 2020, Kamara had 83 catches. 2019, 81 catches. Ekeler in 2020 had 54 catches and 92 catches in 2019. So again, Ekeler missed about 6, 7 games, if I'm not mistaken. So, Ekeler is going to get around 70 to 80 catches this year. That is, if he stays healthy, he's going to get around that number, just because of how versatile of a weapon he is and how much Herbert trusts him out of the backfield. Now, this stat is one of my favorites to look at: yards per route run. Now, when we talk about like how to evaluate receivers and how productive they are, you could always look at total yards or yards per game, but a lot of them are volume driven stats, right? But if we look at yards per route run, this is how it's calculated. You're taking the total amount of receiving yards a receiver has and dividing it by the number of routes run throughout the course of a season. So you're looking at like honest, like a per play basis of how effective and efficient a player is. So in 2020, I'm going to zoom in because it is a little bit smaller than the rest of the bars. Alvin Kamara had a 2.19 yards per route run. In 2019, when he was hurt, he had a 1.54 yards per route run. In 2020, Austin Ekeler had a 1.71 yards per route run. And in 2019, he had the highest out of the 4 bars with 2.74 yards per route run. Now in that, remember in 2019, he was used more as a slot receiver out wide. And this is something I want to see continue. I want to see Austin Ekeler out wide. I want to see him as a slot receiver. I mean, I know we drafted Josh Palmer and all that, and we have guys like Tyron Johnson and Jalen Guyton, but Austin Ekeler is a very, very good pass catcher. And he has probably the best yards after catch ability out of anyone on the team. Actually, he 100% has the highest yards after catch ability out of anyone on the team. So I would like to see him out wide a little bit. And he's a very, very efficient receiver. Now, the next stat is going to be yards after catch per reception. Again, we're doing everything per reception or, per routes run, just because we want to eliminate volume, just because Alvin Kamara and Austin Ekeler were hurt for one of the years that I'm looking at. So in 2020, Alvin Kamara had 8.8 yards after catch per reception. In 2019, 7 yards after catch per reception. In 2020, Austin Ekeler had 8.9 yards after catch per reception. And 2019, he had 10.3 yards after catch per reception. So again, Austin Ekeler, both his bars are higher than Alvin Kamara's bars, which is a great sign. I think it furthers my point that Austin Ekeler is a weapon. No matter where you line him up as, you just need to get him the ball and let him go to work in space. Now we're going to be looking at missed tackles forced on receptions alone. We're not going to be, factoring rushing attempts. These are on receptions alone. Alvin Kamara in 2020, 20 missed tackles forced on receptions, 14 in 2019. And for Austin Ekeler, 14 in 2020 and 22 in 2019. I think 14 in 2020, despite missing 6 games and still having the same numbers as Alvin Kamara, despite having way less catches, is a great sign. And, this is, Austin Ekeler, I think, is a very underrated back, and most people don't have him in their top 10, but I think he's easily a top 10 running back just based on his ability to make people miss after the catch. And the final stat we're going to be using to compare everyone is first downs caught. This is a pretty basic stat, but Alvin Kamara, 35 first downs caught in 2020, 28 in 2019. Ekeler, he had 20 first downs caught in 2020 and 42 first downs caught in 2019. So again, it doesn't matter where you line Austin Ekeler up, as he's going to be able to get you yards and first downs. Now, this was a really interesting stat I think Kevin asked me to look at, and this was looking at the amount of times that Saints had 2 running backs on the field. Now, I will admit this was a little bit challenging to try to find data from, but I did my best to try to make this as accurate as possible. So the way I looked at this, I found, so Warren Sharp has a website where he tracks personnel grouping. So I added up all the times the Saints had 2 running backs on the field. But when you look at personnel grouping, a running back also stands for a fullback, or vice versa. Like a fullback counts as a running back. So there were about like 300 something times where the Saints had 2 running backs / fullbacks on the field. And so I looked at the amount of times they had 2 running backs, and I subtracted Michael Burton, who is the Saints fullback. I subtracted the amount of times he was on the field for offensive plays, and then I got this number. So there were about 54 times where the Saints had 2 running backs, not fullbacks, 2 actual running backs on the field. So this would be Alvin Kamara and Latavius Murray, or Alvin Kamara and DeAndre Washington, or whoever else, Ty Montgomery, whoever else their running backs were. This is the amount of times they ran 2 running back sets. Now, it is somewhat common, 54 snaps. You could pretty much say that's about 3 snaps a game, which is not that big of a number, but you're not going to see many times where you run 2 running back sets. What would this look like for the Chargers? I mean, I would like to see Justin Jackson in the backfield. You go single back, or I formation. You can run Justin Jackson in the backfield and put Ekeler in the slot, Ekeler out wide, try to match him up on a linebacker, or you force a safety to guard Austin Ekeler. Now you have one less guy in the box, and Justin Jackson is a really good runner when he's healthy, so that could open up more things for him. Now, the next thing we're going to look at, is rushing yards over expected. This is a statistic put together. Needs to load real quick. This is a statistic put together by my man Thage. If you haven't gone and checked out our episode from talking about like coverages and all that, make sure to go give that a check. And I want to thank him so much for putting this website together. It is in his pinned tweet on MFB Analytics on Twitter. Make sure to give him a shout out and go check out this website as well. So this is a really good way to evaluate how good a running back is, but they just doing this using actual data instead of tracking data, which is what the NFL uses to create their rushing yards over expected model. And he also mentioned how this doesn't account for scheme or offensive line play, but it's still a very good way to evaluate running backs. So as you can see, as a pure runner, Alvin Kamara has done more significantly well than Austin Ekeler. So you can see, like, if you track the number of attempts from 2019 to 2020, Alvin Kamara far and away beats Austin Ekeler in terms of rushing yards over expected. And this honestly could have to do with him having a stellar offensive line, Teron Armstead and Ryan Ramczyk, and then you got Eric McCoy in the middle. He has had one of the best offensive lines for the past 4 years, and Austin Ekeler has had one of the worst offensive lines for the past 4 years, right? So if we look at the table, Alvin Kamara per rush averages 0.5 rushing yards over expected, and Austin Ekeler averages negative 0.13 rushing yards over expected. Now, we can expect this number for Austin Ekeler to go up just because the Chargers did overhaul their offensive line, and now they have a new scheme, which could open up more things for Ekeler and for the other running backs on the Chargers roster. And just for EPA per rush, remember EPA stands for expected points added. Alvin Kamara is rushing in the negative, or he has a negative EPA per rush at negative 0.03. But Austin Ekeler is worse in that scenario as he has a negative 0.08 EPA per rush. Now, this graph is looking at the type of runs each running back has. Okay, zooming is not going to work there. I'm sorry. But you can see Austin Ekeler has a higher percentage of rushes where he has a negative rushing yards over expected, which isn't good. But again, it could also speak more towards the Chargers scheme and how bad the Chargers offensive line was. He also has a lower percentage of runs from 0 to 5 rushing yards over expected, and similar percentage of runs from 5 to 15 rushing yards over expected, but obviously much less, or a lower percentage of runs that had 15 plus rushing yards over expected. So hopefully Austin Ekeler can improve his efficiency with a better offensive line. But just based on rushing alone, I think Alvin Kamara has been the superior rusher over the past 2 years. So if we look at this graph, we're looking at Kamara's rushing yards over expected for the past 4 years. In 2017, I mean, he was one of the best, if not the best rusher in the league. His efficiency did drop off with more rushes. Remember, Mark Ingram was suspended for the first couple of games for that year, so Kamara's efficiency did dip. It dipped again in 2019 when he was hurt with that knee injury. But 2020, he did improve and got back to his elite rushing ways. Now, Austin Ekeler followed that similar trend, right? In 2017 and 2018, he was the definite number 2 running back. There was no 1A and 1B. So he got limited touches, but he was, again, one of the best. In 2017, if I zoom in, he was 1, 2, 3. He was the 3rd best rusher in 2017 in terms of rushing yards over expected. But again, more carries. He still was right about number 4 in rushing yards over expected in 2018. But in 2019, when he got more carries, his efficiency dipped. And in 2019, I mean, the Chargers were starting guys like Trent Scott and Trey Pipkins at offensive tackle. I wonder why Austin Ekeler's efficiency dipped in that case, right? And in 2020, he got right about back to league average, but with more rushes, it's pretty obvious that some running backs are going to take a hit when it comes to efficiency. Okay, so that was looking at rushing yards over expected. Really quick, I'm just going to look at the NFL's rushing yards over expected model, and I think theirs will be a little more accurate than Thage's, just because they actually use tracking data to evaluate this, which is going to be more accurate than using actual data. So Austin Ekeler averaged 0.27 rushing yards over expected in 2020, and Alvin Kamara averaged 0.55 rushing yards over expected in 2020. So Kamara, per NFL's Next Gen Stats, was a better rusher in 2020. And again, they use tracking data, but this shouldn't take away from Thage's website, just because he's done an awesome job. And he has a lot more stuff that you can look at, like look at these graphs that he's put together. So make sure to give him a follow and take a look at his Twitter at MFB Analytics. This website is his pinned tweet. So that's going to wrap it up for the video. Again, we just looked at Alvin Kamara's and Austin Ekeler's comparison, looking at a bunch of stats and how they stacked up as a pure rusher and as a pure receiver, and where we could potentially see Austin Ekeler line up all over in this offense, out wide in the slot and in the backfield. Make sure to stay tuned for my next upcoming videos. I have a really, really fun one planned. I'm going to be actually looking at, will Justin Herbert regress? And I know that's probably the biggest question of this offseason, and I'm going to be giving my own spin on it. I know Stevens wrote an article about it. You know, if you subscribe to The Athletic, Popper's written some stuff about it. But I'm going to be giving my own analytical spin on it, and it's going to be super awesome for you guys to look at. It's going to be probably a 2-part thing where I look at stats and then a film breakdown of why or why not I think Justin Herbert will regress. So again, that brings us to the end of this episode. And make sure to comment any potential topics like Kevin did that I could look at later this summer. And with that, as always, Bolts up.